The Open Innovation Speaker Series. This is our third session of the series, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Alpheus Bingham from InnoCentive. Dr. Bingham was the founder of InnoCentive and is now on the board. And after 25 years of working at Eli Lilly and working in R&D and portfolio management and seeing innovation from the inside out, launched what has been heralded as one of the really early models of open innovation in theory that Hank had kind of laid out, put to practice. And The Economist rated it as one of the best business process ideas a couple years ago. So we are really thrilled to have Dr. Bingham here to speak to us about crowd-searching solutions space, spot capacity, risk, distribution, and diversity. And for those of you who are planning the rest of your month, in 2 weeks we will have Stephen Benson coming from Innovation Exchange. And it'll be interesting. We had tried to get them together, but I think there's some comparisons that are very fruitful to make between these two business models. And I encourage you to come back in 2 weeks and hear that as well. Final note, we do have to leave right at 5:30 because they are going to clear out the room for another event. And if you want anything to drink or eat, grab it before 5. So with that, let me warm welcome to Dr. Alpheus Bingham, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Sean. With a smaller group, I'll dial down the formality a little bit and invite you to go ahead and challenge me in the middle of the presentation. There's not a deck of slides I feel any need that I have to get through between now and the end of the hour, and then take your questions. The actual content for this particular discussion came about in a couple of different ways. One is in communications with Siobhan, I had sent a note saying, what do you think of these 5 titles? And she came back and said, this is the one I published. And it was actually a mashup of all 5 titles. So I looked at her mashup and said, I can speak to that. It's going to require that I rearrange things and do it a little differently, but I think that might be an interesting approach to the whole effort here. The title is what you might call action-packed. Other than the conjunctions and the punctuation marks, there's not a word in here that doesn't bespeak some type of a concept, and in some ways a concept that is under test, under evaluation in the current organizational and business structures. Open innovation, a term you probably know well. Crowd searching. I'm not trying to usurp Jeff Howe's term or replace it with one, but oftentimes when Jeff, who by the way I'll be speaking with next week, oftentimes when Jeff is talking about crowdsourcing, he's talking about the solution coming from the crowd as a whole, as opposed from an individual within that crowd. So I'll make that subtle distinction. Solution space is really what drives the need for alternative forms of innovation, and I'll touch on that. Spot capacity, risk distribution, and diversity. Knowing that we had a possible opportunity of sharing this forum with Steve Benson, I'm going to draw the distinctions between some of the work that we've done rather than the similarities. I'll call those out, and maybe that will give you some notes to go into the next set of conversations with. Let me start with a quote from a well-esteemed scientist, Damon Runyon, actually not a scientist at all, the author of the Broadway play Guys and Dolls, who didn't know a lot about science, I suppose, but knew a lot about gambling, and a lot about going out and placing your bets, whether that's a research grant or whether it's a $5 bill out of the back of your pocket. Placing your bets on things that are unknown and uncertain is actually part and parcel of science. So he says the race is not always to the swift nor the victory to the strong, but that is how you bet. And contained in that is both a justification for why we did things another way for so long, as well as a hint for an alternative way to do them. I'd like to start by posing a question. Open innovation has had legs now for 5 or 6 years. is it meeting the needs of the companies that are using it? Are they receiving, and then you can pick the adjective you want here, the expected benefits, the full benefits, or the necessary benefits of open innovation? Obviously, I wouldn't have asked the question if I thought the answer was yes. And I think it varies a bit depending on which adjective you use. Unfortunately, they're oftentimes receiving the expected benefits of open innovation because their expectations are so miserably low. So it's not hard to meet the expectations by engaging in open innovation. They are absolutely not receiving the full benefits of it, and whether it's necessary to receive the full benefits or if it's only nice to receive the full benefits probably depends on which sector you're in, which innovation sector. Some innovation sectors, pharmaceuticals for instance, I would stand up here and tell you they'll either learn to receive the full benefits or they won't survive. I think that qualifies as necessary. It comes right down to their sustainability. So I think it's important that we examine why this isn't happening. Some may say that one of the virtues of open innovation is that in a lot of places it's become a corporate initiative. That may be the first nail in the coffin, is when something becomes a corporate initiative. Certain behaviors, certain patterns start to take over that aren't all healthy. Some of them are healthy. They've usually identified a person to be in a leadership position for open innovation in that company. Chief Innovation Officer or some such CXO type of title. They've identified groups who have dedicated roles. Again, at first blush, this seems like a good idea. They've set performance metrics for it. The problem is that any OI is OI. Any OI will do. Because it generally, in my opinion, degenerates into this group with its Chief Innovation Officer, with its dedicated staff for innovating on innovation, standing up and saying, look, we got the boxes checked on this thing. It tends to inflate the operational at the sake or at the sacrifice of the strategic. And there are strategic reasons for entering open innovation as well as the productivity, operational reasons, etc. And the reason that they get their boxes checked so easily is that they can often make a claim such as, we partnered with 73 unique new vendors we'd never partnered with before during this year since you put the OI initiative in place. Obviously, it's successful. But I don't know of any customer who says, I think I'm going to pick that product on the basis of how many novel partnerships they had with vendors this year. And I don't know any chief financial officer who looks at the bottom line and says, wow, you know, we went broke, but by golly, we had 73 new partnerships this year. We'll have to count 2008 as a success. Wouldn't appeal to Lehman Brothers, wouldn't appeal to AIG, and so I think we have to be cautious of some of these pseudo-metrics that get tossed out. Now, I want to focus in on three of the places where I think corporations as a whole are being grossly underserved by their open innovation initiatives. And I'm going to use InnoCentive as a way of just illustrating what I'll be talking about because it's convenient. So in a dozen slides here, I'll walk through and then that's pretty much it as a business example. InnoCentive operates on an internet-based platform. On the one side, we have what we call, and I'll just get a little bit of nomenclature out here so we all speak the same language. We have what we call seeker companies. They're organizations that have some kind of a problem that they would like solved. In the middle, we have a platform, which is a place for them to raise those problems. And on the right-hand side, we have what we call our solver community, also known as the crowd. So when I refer to crowd searching, I mean searching that community of solvers out there. This is no more, there's nothing hidden here, there's no secret sauce, it's no more sophisticated than it looks on this one slide. If you think about the old days, they had a problem, you know, Big John robbed the stagecoach, they had a platform, the sheriff's door where they posted a picture of Big John and they had a crowd to help called bounty hunters. And so this is essentially a bounty hunting business, but is applied to scientific, technological, and innovation problems. Now, who are the seekers? The seekers are, in many cases, the usual suspects. They are the Fortune 500 or the Fortune 1000. They're companies who basically rely on innovation, whether it's pharmaceutical innovation or whether it's assorted product, technological product innovation. You'll recognize the names of most of those companies and the kinds of products that they produce. There's also a list of the unusual suspects, which is something that we weren't fully prepared for, which was the joining of foundations, of not-for-profit institutions who have no equivalent of an R&D function, but who are still dedicated to solving some pretty tough problems, whether it's clean technology, alternative forms of energy, orphan diseases, whatever else it may be. So you see Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, the Oil Spill Recovery Institute that I'll give you an example from, still trying to clean up Prince William Sound from the Exxon Valdez, Prize for Life, which is Lou Gehrig's disease foundation, Rockefeller up there with a plethora of initiatives across disadvantaged populations. The solver community, the crowd I'm referring to, about 160,000. That's not a very big number if you're out there comparing it to LinkedIn or Facebook or any of those kinds of communities. But this isn't 160,000 rank and file citizens on the street. There are about 40% of them hold PhDs in some field or another. They're usually deeply technologically trained. And even though they're distributed all around the world, they tend to be a reasonable concentration of skill and ability to contribute. This is kind of how they're distributed, China being the most populous. Not surprisingly, the distribution chart here, if I were to put up a distribution of nationalities to whom advanced degrees have been awarded, or prize winners in the sciences, you'd get a distribution function that looked pretty similar to this one on an international basis. It's basically where these people live and operate. Yeah.
What's the frequency of visits of the solvers to the site?
It runs a gamut. You've got the lurkers who every once in a while kind of tap in. You've got the people who I can name by name, like Ed Milcarrick in his Canada basement laboratory, who's there every day to see if there's any new problems, because that's basically, he uses this as a bread and butter sort of business for him. So it runs the gamut. Because the problem sets don't turn over, we're currently publishing problems at about a problem a day, which means that if you checked in every 2 weeks, you'd be fairly current. So it doesn't have that kind of stickiness of, this was my last night at the bar on MySpace, sort of tracking internet statistics. Here's I won't go out to the website because, first of all, I don't even know if I'm hot linked here at Berkeley or not. But these are 2 videos on YouTube. You can type in InnoCentive on YouTube and watch the videos if you want. But this is basically the Oil Spill Recovery Institute. One of the problems is that when oil gets really cold, and up at Prince William Sound it gets really cold, oil becomes viscous and just hard to move around. And they were struggling. It was basically limiting the rate with which they could pull it out of the Sound, move it to holding tanks, transfer it to barges, and get it out of the environment back to places where it's better contained. They, engaged with us. They posted the challenge. This is the guy who solved it. If you watch the video, I think the real take-home message from watching the video is, wow, that's an unusual degree of enthusiasm for this type of a problem. But the crowd searching finds this individual, and I will guarantee this, the Oil Spill Recovery Institute would never have found him. He had to basically find them, knowing what they were interested in. And first of all, the contribution that he made wasn't because he realized it had any application to oil. It was because he'd spent some years putting himself through school as a contractor's helper, working in the concrete industry, and he saw some of the tools and techniques they use for moving viscous concrete. They like their concrete viscous. The thicker it is, the sooner it's going to be set, and they can start pulling the forms off and constructing the buildings. And so he basically was applying that knowledge over to this other area, solved their problem well to their satisfaction. This happens to be a pattern that we see repeated over and over in innovation and incentive. And this was a top of my head. I didn't even go out to the scientists and say, give me your best example. These were just ones that I remembered. Retirees doing what they probably did when they were working, but in closely related, not direct fields. Some expert in memory, extracting a component out of a food product that the EPA had labeled a bad actor. Concrete worker, I just gave that example. An undergraduate who's looking at EPA banned arc cleaners. An attorney develops a new route, writes us a letter, and says, wow, I was thinking about tear gas, and I saw your problem, and the tear gas has nothing to do with the problem, but we'll get into what some of these advantages of OI are in a minute, and an astrophysicist finding new polymer use. Again, I will say in all of these cases, the company that was seeking to solve the problem, I will guarantee, would not have found that individual to solve it. They weren't looking in those areas of skills, and even if they had been looking in those areas of skill, they probably would have found 500 others who didn't solve the problem before they found this one. That's why I say crowd searching becomes a critical part of open innovation. So what are some benefits not usually quantified by open innovation corporate initiatives, these OIKIs that I talked about earlier, where they've got all the metrics laid out, reporting regularly to the CEO? I think there are three. I think these are the three ones that are most strategic, have the potential to be most transformative, and are the least exploited by corporations today. One is thinking about open innovation as true spot capacity. Number two, thinking about open innovation as a mechanism for distributing risk, financial risk, execution risk, and scientific uncertainty, hypothesis is just flat wrong risk out into a marketplace. And number three is really tapping diversity. They're going to claim they've tapped diversity, but I can explain to you why they're wrong. So let me start with spot markets. Spot markets, I think, are going to play an increasing role in the economic structure of the world, certainly in the economic structure of the nation. And the reason I believe this is if you go back to the 1930s, prior to the formation of corporate monolith megastructure behemoths, vertically integrated, globally distributed, we're seeing a rise of these types of entities in the 30s, and Ron Coase at Stanford is putting forth an economic theory for why they exist. And the theory that he puts forth has to do with transaction costs. He eventually received the Nobel Prize for it. He says that, in effect, what these institutions are doing is they are minimizing the transaction cost. Now, the transaction cost is not just the cost you pay. It's not just the price you pay for a raw material so you can make your special form of widget and sell it to the market. The transaction cost is everything you had to do before and after acquiring that raw material for your widget. You had to search for a vendor. You had to negotiate with the vendor. You had to put in place safeguards on your contract, on your intellectual property. You had to patent the pieces you could. You had to buy intellectual property rights to the pieces you couldn't. You had to ensure that confidentiality was maintained. Staffs of lawyers, purchasing agents, everybody had to come into being. And he says the reason companies vertically integrate is they find out it's cheaper to own the raw material and make it yourself, and just pass it from one division of the company to the other than it is to pay that price, not just the price of the raw material, but the price of all the transaction costs associated with it. Sorry, that's probably old news, basic Econ 101, and I've drawn the picture in a few slides here, kind of outlining what some of those costs are and why they will do it inside. Inside, buyers and sellers will do as they're told. They all work for the same company. But issues like protection, negotiation, search. Now, in the time that COS, and then of course you got products moving one direction and transaction prices or cash moving the other direction. In the time of COS, 1937, when he wrote that paper, if you go back and read the paper, he talks about all those different types of transaction costs, negotiation, etc. But what do you think was the single most dominating price? If you wanted to become a business and you needed to obtain a raw material, other than the cost of the raw material itself, where was most of the price of the raw material hidden inside your business? Search. In 1937, it was just real hard to find stuff. You know, if you were out in a small startup company in Kansas and you needed a special size steel ball bearing, that wasn't an easy thing to just go get your hands on. Today, that's a completely different cost structure, which is why I argue that being able to move to a spot capacity, spot market type thing for all of these intermediates will eventually result in the vertical disintegration of corporations with market mechanisms tying what are currently divisional pieces together into autonomous type structures. But the reason that most people don't get this out of their open innovation is because the first thing they do is they go out and they float an electronic RFP, okay? So they're not only doing open innovation, they're not only reaching outside the walls of their company, but they're doing it with the internet. Very cool. It's going to play well when when that corporate initiative reports out their results. They went out, and then what do they immediately engage in? So they lowered that search cost, admittedly, because they had the ability to do an electronic RFP. But now they're going to engage in a contract. They're going to want to write that contract in such a way that this is a preferred vendor as opposed to a one-time vendor to be replaced with a more economically efficient one next time. They're going to spend 60 days with their lawyers swapping documents back and forth, trying to decide, negotiating for best prices, etc. They're basically going to eventually fritter away most of the benefits that they could have received in this. What you want, and the reason that I walked through a little bit of the InnoCentive example, is you want no bricks, no mortar, no hires, no fires, no term sheets, no lawyers, no contracts. You want instant access. You want it always on, and you, well, it does require some skills of how to use these kinds of mechanisms. The reason that we built the organization the way we did is we wanted to have a predefined set of terms of engagement, online solver agreements, keep the overhead associated with this transaction to an absolute minimum. If you were to bring me a problem from your company and say, I need this solved, I could have it on the website in front of 160,000 people, 40,000 who have PhDs in 48 hours. Okay? And you'd say, but what will be the terms of engagement? And I'll say they're going to be very simple. You don't get your problem solved, you don't pay. You do get your problem solved, you will pay exactly this amount. And then you will pay this amount to the intermediary company. So everything is standard and templated, which takes those transaction costs and pushes them down to near zero. Risk management, the second area I said that the corporate world is under benefiting from OI. This is a picture of a wanted poster. I kind of made a little allusion earlier to the sheriff's door. This is the wanted poster for one Oliver Curtis Perry. I think he robbed a train. Oh, yeah, here we go. He robbed a train. This was a way in which they distributed risk. Now, you had two ways in which you could bring a fugitive to justice. Actually, America is an unusual place in which you still have this mechanism operating to a larger degree than I think most of the rest of the world would even believe is possible. You guys have watched, what's that bounty hunter show? Somebody's seen it, surely. There's a show about a bounty hunter, guy with big blonde hair. You guys know him. What is it? Yeah, it's on cable. Dog the Bounty Hunter. That's it, Dog the Bounty Hunter. Dog the Bounty Hunter. You know? As somewhat unseemly as that program might appear, there is an economic rationalization that lies behind it. And I'd like to talk about that for just a minute. There's a fundamental question, whether it's in business or social structures, which is who pays for the failure? And it's an interesting question because it seems like the wealthiest should pay for a failure. So in any kind of an engagement with a corporation, chances are that corporation is wealthier than you are as a consultant, or wealthier than you are as a small startup laboratory, or wealthier than you are as a university professor. So they should be picking up the tab for failure. But we've got a lot of cases in which paying for failure can be distributed into a marketplace and done successfly. Lotteries would be one very simple-minded example as to why would a community be willing to pay for failure. And in the case of a lottery, the argument kind of goes like this. A lottery ticket costs $1. If I were to take all the prizes that you could win with that lottery ticket and multiply them times the probability and sum it up, what kind of a number do you think I get? Do you think it comes to $1.50? Make up a number, because you'll probably be fairly close. 10 cents? I think 10 cents is a pretty good guess. I think it comes to about 10 cents. So I got to ask you this question. Knowing that you're about to buy something that you know is mathematically worth $0.10 and you're going to pay $1 for, has anybody in this room ever bought a lottery ticket? Be honest. Okay. There's a few who've resisted. I saw a bumper sticker one time that says, "Lotteries are a tax on people who are bad at math." But I don't think anyone in this room is bad at math in the traditional sense. And yet a lot of you bought lottery tickets. Why'd you do it? Someone has to win. What? So what's worth 90 cents to you?
Thinking about what I would do with the money.
Hope, dreaming, entertainment value. You're exactly right. In fact, it probably comes to 95 cents. So this ticket's worth $1.05. The 10 cents it's really worth, the 95 cents in hope, dreaming, and entertainment value. So it's a good deal to pay $1 for a ticket that's worth $1.05. It turns out that the same kinds of things happen when you take problems and you distribute them into large populations. When we've taken these problems and put them out into the marketplace and then the problem is solved, we're going, well, you had to solve that problem. You had to invest the mental time in it. You had to invest sometimes real materials from your laboratory. You had to take a risk. Why did you take that risk? And as the answer started coming in, what we discovered was that it wasn't about multiplying the probability of success times the dollar values. They said, well, this is an area I've always been interested in. One woman, the memory expert I said, says, well, I kind of like to think of myself as a scientific Sherlock Holmes, and when I saw the problem, I thought, I can solve that. I'm going to be the one who wins this thing. And then in other cases, they said, you know, I started daydreaming about what it was worth. And I thought, wow, what if I actually won $1 million and I also made progress toward Lou Gehrig's disease? That's pretty cool. And others said, you know, I looked at the problem and I realized that this is a tough problem, and if given to anyone at random would be probably take them more than the $10,000 I got for solving it. But the minute I looked at it, I had this flash of inspiration and I smiled and I knew I had the answer. I had an answer nobody had ever thought of before, and I submitted it. We go, how long did it take you to work on that? This was the attorney. He says, about 4 hours. It's probably the best billing I've ever actually done. So it's the same principle operating on a large scale when we look at these things. When you distribute risk from some centrally held unit into a marketplace, they don't absorb the same risk you distribute out. So there's an asymmetry to the whole issue that makes it work. Now, I just have a couple slides to kind of document where risk is bearing. This is from the pharmaceutical industry. Basically, what's marked in red, and this is a future goal. This was the reality at the time the analysis was done. The reality is probably pretty close to this too. It's looking at the different stages and saying, at any given stage, how much of the work that goes on inside of a company is working on a failure and how much is working on a success. Red being they're working on a failure. They don't know it's a failure. They're not stupid. If they knew it was a failure, they wouldn't be working on it, but it's uncertain. And by looking backward, you can see how much time did you spend working on failures versus the time you spent working on success. And unfortunately, this underestimates the amount of red failure effort versus white because it doesn't count the number of times they worked on failed experiments for something that ultimately became a successful drug. So you got to take all the white parts on here and shade them pink and white for failed hypotheses and failed endeavors. And you can see that some of these industries are basically living under a huge cloud of failure execution. And finding a mechanism for distributing that risk with asymmetry, without the people taking on the risk on behalf of that corporation, there are perhaps alternative ways. This is a way in which you could cure Lou Gehrig's disease. The reason you could never cure it under this model is because there would never be enough probability for return to ever make it worth taking on. So the community takes on the risk. They pay for results. The seekers pay for results, not efforts. Basically a bounty hunting business model. By diversify utilities, I mean you've got the reasons for buying that lottery ticket that aren't, well, it was only worth a dime, but I got 95 cents worth of hope, entertainment, and daydreaming out of it. Finally, let me talk a little bit about diversity. An example that I like to use to sort of illustrate how diversity works in problem solving comes from my present hometown. Actually, I grew up in California, so this is an area I know pretty well. But my present hometown is Indianapolis, Indiana, where the Indy 500 is run every May. Come about the beginning of May, there's going to be a lot of talk radio shows, and there's going to be a lot of chatter on there. It's going to be all about the race that's coming up. They're going to be looking at who the most likely winners are. They're going to be looking at what the teams are doing with their cars, how they're carbureting them, who's having what problems, what are the tires like, what kind of weather conditions might there be. And talk radio is going to go on endlessly throughout the entire month of May talking about the Indy 500. In that environment, I want you just to imagine a hypothetical situation that the disc jockeys moderating this talk radio get off on a tangent. And off on this tangent, someone says, and I don't know why they'd say this, but it's a good example anyway. Well, who came in third in the 1938 running of the Indy 500? Now, if you're on a talk radio program in Indianapolis, Indiana, and that question gets thrown out, what happens? Someone, they look it up? You think they look it up? It's Indianapolis, Indiana. It's not Berkeley. 1938. Someone probably does know it. Yeah, and not only do they know it, but he studied that person. It's his personal hero. He can tell you everything about him. I mean, it's kind of weird when you stop and ask, how is knowledge distributed? You know, we're used to taking problems that are outside our areas of expertise and doing exactly what you say, looking them up. But if I have a large population, there's someone in that population who looked it up already, who didn't just look it up already, but who lives it and breathes it. That is a way of tapping into diversity that is not happening in open innovation 99% of the time right now. Because when you sent out that electronic RFP, you got back companies that were qualified to work on your problem. Qualified to work on your problem. How did you decide they were qualified to work on your problem? You looked at their credentials, you looked at the degrees their staff had, you looked at the kind of problems they'd solved in the past. In other words, you stripped all the diversity out before you even hired any of them to come in. Never mind the negotiating, transacting cost problem associated with that. You stripped all the diversity out of the system before you. Yeah, you've never worked with them before. You're going to check the diversity box when you take it in front of the CEO. But I'll tell you this, you've got no diversity in that system because the biases that you brought to that problem are the same biases by which you selected this organization to be your problem solver. The bias that says this is a petroleum sludge problem is the same bias that kept Osry from ever talking to the concrete industry. And they kept them, and if they did talk to the concrete industry, they were probably engineered so thoroughly away from this one kid who says, wow, that's really interesting, the way that concrete that's so thick when it's not being irradiated starts moving when it is. They'd kind of lost that ability to see inside the problem. This is the final bit on, I think I've checked all the boxes in that title except solution space. I haven't checked solution space. So let me just say a few words about it and why diversity, real diversity, is absolutely essential for companies to benefit from the strategic and transforming powers of open innovation. The problem is space is mostly empty. We've got this picture here of space, and if you look at it, it's mostly a vacuum. Little hot spots where there are stars or galaxies or other things, but mostly it's just an empty vacuum. Well, solution space is no different. What the physicists call phase space, which is the combination of all the axes necessary to solve a problem. Okay, I'm looking for a new drug. Well, I've got one axis called safety. So maybe my vertical thing is, well, it has to be safe enough, and then I got an axis called efficacy, and I got an axis called absorbability, and I got an axis, usually these things are 26-dimensional or something. Can't see them too well on the overhead projector, but it represents this same sort of a problem. The reason the Rubik's Cube is a challenging puzzle isn't because there are over 1,000 ways to solve the Rubik's Cube. It's because there are over 1 billion ways not to solve the Rubik's Cube. That's what makes it interesting. Solution space, like real space, is mostly empty. How do we navigate from this empty space towards solutions? And I'll use two contrasting examples to illustrate that. The first being Thomas Edison. That wasn't the quote I wanted. I'll just jump to here and come back to it. Edison kind of knew enough about science and technology that there probably was a light bulb to be invented. You know, he knew that electricity, when passed through certain kinds of conductors, gets hot. You know, we've known since the days of campfires that hot things glow. And so there was probably a light bulb somewhere to be invented in there. He just had to find the right combinations of material, surrounding atmosphere, voltage, etc., that was going to produce a light bulb. So Edison had a hypothesis. I don't remember what his first hypothesis was, but he had a hypothesis. I remember a fairly early one. He says, if I take some twine and I impregnate it with carbon so that it has some conductance, electrical conductance, and I wind it up real tight, and I stretch it over the poles, and I hook an electric current to it, I'll have light. And he did it, and he had light for about, a millisecond or two, and then the rope burned up, and, the carbon became CO2, and he didn't have a light bulb anymore. But he had a start. And so what Edison did is he says, I'll take that start, and that tells me, paper burns out too fast. So I'm going to use something, I'm going to use asbestos fiber that's not going to burn out as fast. So he does another experiment. This is just the scientific method you've all been exposed to before. Tacking along, taking the results of each prior experiment and informing the next one. That's what led Edison to this brilliant comment when he was challenged, I now know 1,000 ways not to make a light bulb. When they said, have you made any progress on that light bulb at all? Oh yeah, I've made lots of progress. I now know 1,000 ways not to make a light bulb. If we just put that in business terms for a minute, how many of the shareholders in the world want the scientists and the companies they own stock in to find 1,000 ways not to make a new product? In most cases, they wouldn't consider that a very good use of their funds. Edison got away with it, and Edison not only got away with it, but he sort of created a frame of mind out there. And the frame of mind he created is, but that's just the way it is. There's nothing you can do about it. You've got to tack through this big empty space. You've got to find the 1,000 failures before you find the one success. So buck up and get on with it and write your checks and keep them coming in, shareholders, because that's the way you get to light bulbs, phonographs, and other things.
You had a very memorable way of putting it. Genius is 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration.
That's so terrific. It's the last slide of my presentation. No, it's perfect. It's perfect. It's exactly what he said. He said 99%. Yeah, he said genius. You know, I wrote invention, but I'm wrong and you're right. So actually, you've got the right last slide for my presentation. Genius is 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. I think that ought to change, okay? And I'll talk about how we would change that. Let's see, am I going backwards? Yeah. In contrast, let's look at the Archimedes story. Somebody remember the Archimedes story? Hero, the tyrant of Syracuse. That was his official title. You know, it's what was stamped on the crown and everything. It wasn't just a slur. Hero, the tyrant of Syracuse, had a crown made. And he began to wonder if the artisan had ripped him off. Long story short, it came down to this. How do I know what the volume is of an irregular shaped object like a crown? And Archimedes had this problem placed at him, and of course he tackled it like any scientist, mathematician, engineer would. He thought about, how do I calculate the equation for describing the volume of a crown if I know the crown's height, the crown's circumference, and other kinds of things. And he reported to the tyrant, there's no known way to measure the volume of an irregularly shaped object. He goes home and begins to take a bath. He draws water for his tub, and he has an experience that we have all had many times. He starts lowering himself into the tub, watching the water rise on the side, and asking himself, am I about to flood the bathroom here? As he watches the water rise up in his regularly shaped, rectangular tub, it suddenly occurs to him that he is measuring the volume of his irregularly shaped body. Exactly what he just told Hero couldn't be done. So, as the story has it, he shouts, "Eureka, Eureka, I found it, I found it." He jumps naked out of the tub, runs through the streets of Syracuse. Now, that's not exactly 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. I don't know what the ratio is in this case, but it's clearly different. And so the question is there some way to institutionalize the Archimedes type way of discovering a solution in space versus the Edisonian way of stepping into space and then tacking your way to it? And I would argue that no, there's not a way to do it with Archimedes alone. But if Hero had presented the problem to 1 million geometers around the world, someone was going to take a bath. Somebody was going to put a leg of lamb in a pot of boiling water on the stove. Somewhere that was going to happen. So you've got this serendipitous event that you can only probably access through sheer numbers. But if you could access it regularly through those numbers, you would have an alternative. The Edisonian organization obviously has to reward execution because it's your ability to navigate that is the prime skill that you want. And our academic institutions are very, very big on training us to navigate through space. You would have to employ some kind of an algorithmic response. Now, we don't need to go through those things. You get the point from the story. The Archimedean organization, on the other hand, would be focused on outcomes, not navigation. It would probably employ some self-selection and feedback. In other words, if you stepped into space and you realized it was cold and frigid, you'd probably say, I'm not going to keep working. I'm not going to navigate. But if you stepped into space and it was sunny and warm, you might say, I think there's a star nearby. I can get to it a lot faster than those guys who stepped in to a frigid zone. I think one of the problems with, I think brainstorming sessions are good, but I think brainstorming sessions may lack mass. You know, at the level they're usually practiced, they may lack mass. Now, what they make up for is often the hitchhiking on one another's idea, the ratcheting effect, that there is a feedback loop going on in the room live, because they're almost always done, you know, in a verbal public. I hear all of your ideas, plus I get to add a little piece of mine. And so they synthesize. In fact, they synthesize better than crowd searching. When I draw the distinction between crowd searching and crowdsourcing, that's a present-day step along the path. I think that if you could take the advantages of the larger populations, the greater mass, and the hitchhiking on ideas, you could move up into optimum solution space even faster than you do today. But brainstorming offers one advantage, the hitchhiking ratcheting mechanism. Crowd searching offers a different advantage, which is we're stepping into many, many more points. Although, you know, I'll telegraph it, we've talked about true crowdsourcing for these types of problems and how they'd work, and we've got some not-for-profits willing to engage us in that conversation. The complication with crowdsourcing ideas that are inherently intellectual property is who's the IP holder. And companies today don't like a lot of ambiguity around who the IP holder is. So that has been the barrier that's kept us from moving that direction any more rapidly. The not-for-profits have a very different attitude. I couldn't remember what the second noun was in the title of the structure. That's exactly right, the structure. It is. Okay, well.
Insight.
Huh?
Insight.
Yes. And this is a paraphrase of it, but it's essentially you know, what Kuhn talks about in the book, and in several places in the book, where, and you know, we've got plenty of examples from history. You've got Gregor Mendel, you've got Albert Einstein. I mean, you know, there's no lack of stories to be told of those bringing in solutions. Again, this is diversity. They are not the people who you would bet on. I'm going to tie this back to that first quote. The race is not always to the swift or the strong, but that is how you bet. And if I had to take my money and I had to say, who do I think can solve this problem? Let's make it a chemistry problem. I might very well be doing exactly what Lilly did the year I joined him, recruiting at 5 institutions in the world. UC Berkeley, Stanford, Caltech, Harvard, and MIT. Why? Because I have to bet on the swift and the strong. And that's where I'm going to probably find them. Now, on the other hand, I can tell you from having worked at InnoCentive and posted problems all around the world that that is not where the breakthrough usually comes from. It usually comes from outside the field. It comes from a memory expert over here. It comes from an attorney over there. So I remind you of the kinds of things that we've actually seen around diversity. Really tapping diversity, not pretending you're tapping diversity like a lot of OI implementers do, generates more approaches to the challenge. It enables far greater amounts of lateral thinking. It actually can become a searching algorithm for prior sources. Not everything has been published. And so it can become a search algorithm tapping the most efficient pattern recognizing computing devices we've got out there today, which is sitting up there in your own skulls. And it enables the aha effect. It is finding Archimedes as he lowers himself into the tub. And it sets up options for downstream processing. The dangerous idea, this is the effect where a company or anybody else for that matter, university professor, gets an idea and it's just successful enough to keep them trapped, beating and beating on that idea instead of having options for processing when downstream knowledge tells you it's time to bet on a different horse. So I'll correct it. Genius. This is the equation that basically we'd like to talk about updating. We'd like to use OI for its transformative and strategic capabilities. We recognize that there's always going to be a good part of perspiration, but I tell you, if you just change that equation to 90-10 and think about what the productivity effect could be on innovation, whether it's removing oil from the Prince William Sound, whether it's designing new drugs, whatever it might be. We need to get away from that notion, that idea that got instilled, but that's just what you have to do if you're doing research. I think we've got capabilities for communication and information exchange now that actually obviates that and says that really efficient entities will tap into the crowd in a fundamentally different way than they have before. So that is my last slide.
My own, which I can start with, and then open up the floor.
You want to start with one, and then we'll grab this gentleman
okay.
here?
I'll give you my first one. I'll save my second one. But I understand part of InnoCentive success is really having well-scoped and well-defined problems. And I would say from the companies and clients you've been working with, what proportion or percent of the things they're working on in their R&D pipeline are they able to scope in that defined way that will help them fit into the InnoCentive model?
Yeah, this is, I've talked about where companies have not tapped in, and I hope I haven't made it sound like they're wrong to use any other mechanism of open innovation, because there are constraints. In order to tap these advantages, you do have some constraints on the kinds of problems you can post. When you posted that wanted poster, you had to say dead or alive, and it made a difference. And you had to be able to specify what the criteria were for success. The same thing is true. If I'm looking for a new synthetic route to a compound, or I'm looking for a new way to get oil out, I've got to be able to define what success looks like. There are times when research organizations are working on a problem which is so gray, fuzzy, and ill-defined that they don't even know what an answer would look like, and they need to stumble around for a bit of the time. I understand that. I've been in that part of the R&D boat myself. So I would say that if I were to just throw a number out, I would say they could probably use a defined method between 20 and 40% of the time. Okay, they could probably define it a priori, and I picked that number somewhat randomly, but I also know that we've had a lot of experiences where we've gone into a company and we've said, now in order to post this problem and have our solver community work on it, we need to define what success looks like. And by the time we got them done writing the problem, they said, oh my gosh, we understand this problem so much better now than we, They go into that research mode of wandering around hoping something exciting will happen way too soon, and stay in it way too long. And so, my criticism is that they think this is a bigger barrier than it actually is. It's incumbent on them to be able to clearly state what the objectives of their program are, and they could do it more often. But I didn't come close to 100% because I do recognize that some of these alternative ways of using open innovation, like ideation, jam sessions, brainstorming issues, in some new kind of a public forum, all of these have their place to make it up to the remainder of that 100%. My question is...
Should be on. There we go. So my question is also on problem formulation. And what's interesting is that you seem to provide 3 different ways for navigating that solution space toward the end. There was the scientific method, which takes a very narrow problem-solving approach, controls and et cetera, and then sort of tacks back, as you said. There's social search, where you ask somebody that you might know that actually is a little bit broader, but it still is a narrow focus because the bias is you rely on your social network, and they constrain it.
That's right.
And then the open innovation, which is sort of the broadest way.
And you pre-pick who you think knows the answer.
Well, that's
better
right,
than
because
others.
it's your social circle. That's who you know. And then the open innovation method seems to get away from this and have a broad solution space that you can draw from. But I'm actually wondering, what is the appropriate problem formulation? Each one has if you want to think of it as a field of vision for your problem space. The scientific method is necessarily narrow because you have a null and an alternate hypothesis you must disprove in order to do that. Right? But the OI approach is there is no such constraint. You just say, do this for me, and pick out however you want to do it. So I'm wondering, how does one, are you really looking at different phases of the solution with those methods? Meaning that you go the OI approach to find the right way, use the social search way to figure out how to narrow in on it, and then use a scientific method to prove whether it's truly valid or not. Is that the pipeline?
I'm not sure that it's clearly a pipeline and that the three follow each other chronologically. Okay, but the three all have merit and should be applied at appropriate times. The social search maybe a little less, again, because it has some of the weaknesses of both, is what it suffers from, in that it doesn't have enough diversity to really overcome that. It's got the biases already built in. Interestingly enough, it's the one that we're surprisingly comfortable with and that we use a lot. In fact, there's some analysis of who wants to be a millionaire, and when they go to a lifeline, do they go with, I know a really smart guy, I'm going to ask him, or do they go with a random audience? And it turns out the data suggests that they should use a random audience more than the really smart guy they know, but they tend to let those biases cloud their judgment. So I agree that there's a place for all of them. I'm not sure they're completely chronological, but the first step is knowing to even ask the question you asked. And I can tell you this, a lot of those companies out there are not asking themselves that question. They're not drawing a taxonomy in open innovation and saying this mode of open innovation is appropriate here and that mode is appropriate there. They're taking it all as a broad field, and as long as I'm engaged in it, I must be okay, right? And I think that that's the wrong way to approach it, and that yours is much, much closer to the right way to approach it.
And then a corollary to this, is there a bias that you noticed with your open innovation method? And that's my last question.
You mean with this method?
Was there a bias there that you noticed?
A bias in terms of the types of problems that are worked on, or the ones that...
In my thesis, scientific method has a narrow field, and that's its bias. Social search has a bias of mob mentality if you go to the wrong place. And is there one to go on?
It's a good question. I don't know that I've ever been asked it before. Similar to what you say is a narrow constraint on scientific method, there is a constraint on the types of problems that are suitable for this. It's not a constraint on the execution, but as I acknowledge that I might place 20 to 40% of the typical research lab's problems in this category, but that means I'm placing 60 to 80% outside of it. So there is a bias toward problem type, and the problem type is that to use these, to really capitalize on those 3 points that I made, you have to be able to describe success in advance, and that's not always true.
Can you talk a little bit about the necessary elements within open innovation to solve problems that may have a subjective answer or not a discrete variable yes or no answer?
Yeah, this is an interesting area, and in one of the companies that I was involved with during startup, we wanted to tackle this where there was some ambiguity, and we thought, well, can we do it with a go with the crowd? Are there ways to statistically analyze a crowd's response to decide when it's giving you clear good guidance and when it's giving you clear bad guidance, and a way to just flip a coin when you're in between? And so we looked at doing error analysis, failure statistics, and tried to say, well, if clearly the crowd is showing an obvious bias toward one, it raises the probability that it's actually true. If the crowd is dividing itself up statistically among the choices, a 5-choice answer, and it's 20, 20, 20, 20, 20, you've essentially received no information from the crowd, and then there are ways of kind of judging your confidence level in between those. So other than that kind of a statistical approach, I don't know, because the minute you start deciding that person A in the crowd is better than person B, you're back to injecting that other type of bias, your own personal bias, into what constitutes a good answer. So I think that that's not a completely worked out problem. I will say, though, that I like some mechanisms of aggregating that knowledge better than others, and I'll just draw one contrast. I like trading better than polling, okay? There are some instances where they actually create a knowledge market and you trade in essentially an option on an outcome, and you buy stock in that outcome, and then when there's a strike price, an event in the real world that sets the hard price of that asset, the question is, where was it trading relative to that hard price, and when? And I think that mechanism is better than a polling mechanism. It'd be a long discussion in here to talk about why I prefer one over the other, but I think all too often we try to crowdsource subjective, ambiguous things with polling mechanisms, and we probably should be using trading mechanisms. Yeah.
Thanks. It seems that the ideal situation might be for an individual with a question to be able to ask the entire population. But for obvious reasons, it seems that that's not feasible. Our inboxes would be even more full and chaotic than they currently are. So it seems that it's inherent in the problem that there's going to be some structure given to this network of open innovation.
Right.
And if that's the case, then it seems like fundamentally there's always going to be some bias in the selection of that network. So it sounds like perhaps what you're really talking about is a selection of that network in a smarter way, and perhaps leaving the barriers more permeable, more open than they typically are, so that it's more flexible, perhaps.
We're running right up against that now. It used to be, when we had 10 problems out there, we just posted them to anybody, right? But now that we've got 1,000 problems or whatever is up there now, we feel like we have to have some taxonomy. Okay, this is a problem in chemistry and physical sciences. This is a problem in social engineering. And our very act of putting them in those boxes is biasing, because our data said, well, if you post it in the chemistry section, the lawyer might not read it because he might spend all of his time reading the cultural legal transformations or whatever category. So we run the risk of subdividing our solver population into the wrong buckets. So what do? Well, we've talked about just random cross-posting, where there is some randomization mechanism, and there's some interesting stories we could tell about why that might work. The other thing is that we've started also moving toward what we call a pavilion, in which there is a big overarching concern that is not disciplinary. Like there's a clean tech pavilion, there's a healthcare transformation pavilion, and some others out there now. SAP, who you probably saw, we just formed a big partnership with, has got essentially an information technology pavilion. And so by moving problems into pavilions, we're actually matrixing them with disciplinary abilities, so that we try to get cross-disciplinary but intra-pavilion things. I don't know, it's a big problem, because as you get larger and larger and larger, and then you've got 10,000 and 20,000 and 100,000 problems, now you're going to have to start using search engines to find the ones you're interested in. That's going to cause a huge biasing back to the traditional categories. If you've got a real good answer for the question you asked, you'll share it with me, because I think it's a tricky thing, and I don't want to believe I've got a scale limit there, but it's worth thinking about. Let me go here, and then I'll come back there. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. He did have his hand up for quite a bit. I apologize.
So my question goes to this. You're working a lot with companies, and the traditional model for companies, employees or hiring, is based on experience and trying to go down to find where you can either get experience or where people are trained. So what is it that you see in terms of companies, in terms of how would you think that companies would be able to resolve that conflict of going through their traditional models of hiring and dealing with those kinds of problems with this kind of innovation? It seems to be taking them in really opposite directions.
You're exactly right. And my advice is don't change your model, because Damon Runyon is still right. The race is not to the swift and the strong, but that is how you bet. And when you're bringing the person inside your company and you're paying them a salary month after month after month, you're betting. And you should bet on the swift and the strong. You should recruit those with the strongest skill sets, those that interview effectively, because that is where you're placing the bet. Here's how I would say to integrate that with the new world. But think about using them in a different way than you used them before. You have now made this swift and strong individual an insider of your company. Let them figure out what the most important problems are to work on to meet your strategy. So they become the problem definers. Let them define what sub-element of that problem is the most critical to solve, and let them disintegrate the problem into 10 critical sub-pieces. Then, because the race is not always to the swift and the strong, tell them to stop work at that point and put it out for an open innovation solution and tapping that diversity. Then when those solutions come back in, 100 solutions in each of those 10 sub-elements, now their job as an insider is to winnow through those, figure out what's best in each of the sub-areas, and how do I integrate them into a new innovative product whole. That's a very different role than you've ever used those people in before as a company. But since you're betting on the swift and the strong, in some ways I'd say it's a more challenging role than you've used them before in the past. That's where you really want to nurture them and build up their skills and their strengths. Take the actual problem solving, the search of big gangly solution space, outsource that, but keep inside that orchestration process. So I don't think it completely destroys the jobs for those who have physics degrees from Berkeley. I think they're fine, but they may be doing slightly different work.
Right. We have just these last couple comments, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. We're running a little over here.
This gentleman here had his hand up, and then we'll go back there.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so are you in favor to tell us a little bit technical background of your open innovation systems? I mean, technical foundation of that. If you get thousands of ideas from somebody else, so how can you organize or extract the key portion from these very different wording, for example?
Yeah, it's surprisingly easier than you might think, and it's a little bit like grant review committees. First of all, our number one job is just to winnow out the chaff. I mean, there is some information that is clearly garbage. It's surprisingly small. It's like 10%. Okay? But passing that on to the company that posted the problem doesn't benefit us, the solver, or anybody else. In fact, it makes them wonder, don't those guys know anything about what they're trying to help me do? And so we filter that out. And most of the time, a good scientist can recognize pure BS and separate it to the side. So we do that filtering mechanism. The second thing that we filter for is we work with the companies and we say, are there specific filters you want? And that usually is for reasons of intellectual property contamination. And they can simply educate our scientists. We use PhD scientists to read all of these as they come in. They educate our scientists well enough that they simply filter those out. So that takes out, let's say, 10 more percent. 80% we don't deal with. We don't tell our customers that we can deal with them. We give them to our customer and we say it's your job to go through the 80% and figure out which ones you want to reward and recognize, which is the role of that individual group. So we leave that deep, deep specialized skill set inside the company. We don't try to duplicate it. There's one final question, and he had his hand up, but I'll be happy to talk to you as soon as we break up. Okay, catch me afterward.
So to what extent do you think the open innovation model that InnoCentive is championing can be applied to scientific problems coming from the academic community as opposed to corporate R&D? And do you see a path forward for universities to adopt this model?
We've talked with some universities, and here's the issue, is that a lot of university faculty, graduate students, I mean, I was a graduate student, I know what it was. They proved their chops by their ability to move through that navigation chart, okay? And so you wouldn't want to outsource it into an open innovation model like this because you wouldn't be demonstrating the prowess that you intended to demonstrate either in earning your PhD or in establishing your reputation within your scientific community. What they aren't interested though in doing is some of the peripheral work. You know, for example, I knew a professor, Stanford. He was very interested in potential applications of marine, very novel marine marine-derived chemical structures. But he didn't want to set up a screening lab for toxicology or for drug efficacy. So he could have outsourced a piece of that. It wouldn't have impacted the quality of the papers he was writing, wouldn't have been in the area of marine biochemistry that he was really specialized in. But on the other hand, once he does that, now he starts to form something greater than a academic research unit. He starts to become a little quasi-new drug discovery unit. And a lot of faculty are probably not going to want to expand in that area. Now, I say not a lot, but maybe some. And you do see universities, institutions like Berkeley, Stanford, and others, who set up the Center for. And it's in these Center for that they have the opportunity to really use this. I would say in individual research work, I don't see as much application. But in the Center for, there's probably a lot of that they could benefit from tapping into this. The truth is, though, that a lot of those Centers for aren't held to the same expectations of output as a corporation with shareholders. And so, you know, it's not incumbent on them to have to move to newer levels of productivity and efficiency. And it's good work if you can get it. I mean, I loved being at the bench. Thank you. I think we're going to,
Yep.
Did you have one more question?
Just about to wrap up.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I'll just ask it really quick. I know InnoCentive is launching InnoCentive platform for inside businesses.
Yes.
And two questions. How you expect to get the diversity inside companies? Are you looking only at really large companies? And how you expect to adjust the bounty or your internal?
Okay. I think everyone heard the question. We are placing an InnoCentive product inside of a single company and making it available to other single companies. So the question is, how do you get the diversity and how do you bounty that? In one of the companies we're working with, they have actually gone to a recognition and compensation thing in which they use an internal currency that allows them to buy some fairly substantial stuff. I think like jet skis and things. I mean, so not a shirt with a name embroidered on it only, but they're using an internal currency and they want to use that internal currency as the bounty. So that's one solution, but I'm sure that when we've worked with 100 companies, we'll have 100 different answers to your question. The second thing is they're not going to get the diversity. Okay, I mean, I already know this. And part of what we're going to do is we're going to prove to them they don't have the diversity that they believe. I mean, part of doing this experiment is to say to them, guys, you just don't have it, and you never will. By the way, though, because we're building the platform inside your company, we're going to put a little click-on radio button next to the challenge that says publish to the world. Click, and it will be immediately ported over to the InnoCentive website, and it will go up for public perception. So we think that by building the capability inside, we're going to take them through an experience that's going to eventually help the model. The strategy behind the product.
Thank you
you.
so much.